Sara woke with a start to the sound of a girl's urgent whisper. "Hey, wake up!" Opening her eyes, she found herself in a dark, unfamiliar place. Bars surrounded her on all sides. Was it a cage or a cell? As her vision adjusted to the gloom, she made out the shadowy form of a girl in another barred enclosure to her right. "What's your name?" the girl asked in broken English. "Sara," she replied, crawling closer. "How did you know I spoke English?" "Your hair, it's red." Sara reflexively touched her auburn locks. "Where are we?" The girl shrugged. "Don't know. I'm Catalia, like the flower." "Are there other kids here?" Catalia nodded. "Yeah, but they're asleep now. You'll meet them in the morning. It depends on the day how many there are." A sickening dread gripped Sara's stomach. Trying to distract herself, she asked, "Got a family?" "I have a brother," Sara said after a heavy pause. "But I lost him a few months back." At those words, the grief and guilt she had been holding at bay crashed over her. She began to sob, shoulders shaking with the force of her anguish. Catalia reached a comforting hand through the bars. "Get some sleep," she whispered. "They wake us up early." Sara cried herself into a restless slumber, haunted by thoughts of her lost brother Sammy. He was only 7, small for his age with a mop of red hair to match her own. Sammy never went anywhere without the beat-up yellow toy car he'd had since he was a toddler. Had he been captured too? Was he somewhere in this miserable place? Was he even still alive? Glaring lights snapped on, jolting Sara awake. She took in her surroundings with rising horror, a long room filled with 2 rows of cages like some macabre human kennels. To her left huddled a teenage boy, face hidden against drawn-up knees. Across from her, a weeping little girl who looked no older than 5 stood gripping the bars of her cage. "That's Benny," Catalia said, noticing the direction of Sara's gaze. "She came in with you last night. And that's Vicente," she added, nodding to an older stone-faced boy. "He and I were some of the first, brought in when the raid started." Catalia pointed out a younger nameless boy as well, but he never spoke or even looked their way. Sara's attention was drawn to the quiet teen sharing the cage to her left. Approaching the bars between them, she tried to ask his name, first in English, then in tentative Spanish. "Como te llaman?" No response. "Me llamo Sara," she offered. This earned a hint of a smile before he glanced away. There was something about him, an air of defiance masked beneath the blank expression, that made him stand out from the others' beaten-down despair. "Hey, Guerra," the boy Catalia had called Vicente addressed Sara, voice dripping disdain. She shot him an unimpressed look. "¿Qué? How'd you learn Spanish?" he asked. "How'd you learn English?" she fired back. He smirked. "Need it for when white people like you show up." "Shut it, Vicente," Catalia hissed. "They're coming." The sharp click of heels on tile announced a new arrival. A severe woman in a lab coat, hair pulled back in a tight bun, marched down the aisle, white-knuckled hands clutching a glass tablet. She stopped at each cage, confirming its occupant against something on her screen. "That's Josefina," Catalia murmured once she had moved out of earshot. "She checks everyone's status, makes sure we're healthy." The last word came out brittle and bitter. "Why does it matter?" Sara asked, dreading the answer. Catalia's face darkened. "You'll see soon enough." The hours crept by, each minute stretched taut with unnamed fears. Terrified screams and choked sobs drifted from some unseen room, the sounds of agony cycling endlessly. Groups of children were escorted out at intervals by blank-faced guards, not all of them returning. Sara watched them pass with a growing sense of sickened understanding. When it was her turn, a stony guard unlocked her cage and prodded her out with the barrel of his gun. He led her down winding hallways lined with doors, a tiny barred window set in each one. Desperate for any scrap of information, Sara gathered her courage. "Excuse me," she ventured, voice quavering only slightly. "I was wondering, my brother, is he here?" Silence. She pressed on. "Please, I just want to know if he's alive. His name is Sammy, he's only 7. Red hair like mine, always has a little yellow toy car. The guard cut her a look, irritation, and something almost like pity warring in his expression. A last name, she shook her head. The man sighed and motioned for her to keep moving. They emerged into a large cafeteria, filled with long tables and the sour stench of institutionalized despair. Older teen prisoners doled out meager portions of rice and beans. Sara accepted a tray with shaking hands, scanning the room for any sign of Sammy's telltale carroty hair. She spotted the defiant boy from the cage next to hers sitting alone and approached him.
¿Puedo sentarme contigo?
He glanced up, one eyebrow raised.
Relax, chica.
I'm not from Mexico either. Mexican, but born in America. He shook his head at her still hovering uncertainty. Well, sit down. We don't get long to eat. Oh, right. I'm Sara, she said, sliding onto the bench across from him. Richard, he replied around a mouthful of food. Catalia and Vicente joined them, the former plopping down beside Sara as Vicente straddled the bench next to Richard. So, you're finally talking, Vicente said, not unkindly despite his brusque tone. Name, age, where you from? Let's hear it. Richard, 15. California. He took another huge bite. Vicente turned to Sara expectantly. She forced down the lump of rice she'd been choking on. Sara, almost 15. There was no other choice. The others nodded in somber understanding. No one pressed for details. As they ate, Sara worked up the nerve to voice the question burning in her mind. The terrible things happening here. Have you seen a little red-haired boy? My brother Sammy? They exchanged glances, heads shaking with resigned sympathy. Sara felt her heart fracture a little more. If you hear anything, even, she swallowed hard. Even if he's gone, I need to know. Solemn nods all around. They finished the meal in heavy silence. That night, curled up on the cold cement floor of her cage, Sara let the tears come. She cried for Sammy, for the childhood brutally ripped away from them both, for the unthinkable future that yawned ahead. Exhausted by her own sobs, she finally succumbed to sleep. A terrified shriek jolted her awake. Sara bolted upright to find a wild-eyed girl clinging to the bars of her cage, breath coming in ragged gasps, skin sallow and strange. The girl opened her mouth as if to speak, but pounding footsteps sent her scurrying back into the shadows. Sara? Richard's low voice drifted over from the next cage. What's going on? A girl. She was trying to escape, I think. Do you think she made it? I don't know. Sara pressed her face against the bars, as close to Richard as she could manage. You should get some rest. We don't know what fresh hell tomorrow brings. Richard mirrored her position, the two of them clinging to that small connection as they drifted into uneasy sleep. Morning brought a grim-faced guard banging on Sara's cage. Despertars, he barked. Rise and shine. She followed him through the now familiar maze of hallways, stomach twisting with each step. They passed the cafeteria, heading into uncharted territory. The guard shoved her through an unmarked door. Inside, a metal table with ominous leather straps dominated the room, vicious-looking instruments gleaming on a side counter. Sara backpedaled in horror, colliding with the guard's solid chest. He thrust her forward and she fell hard, too paralyzed with fear to catch herself. A woman's falsely honeyed voice sounded from behind. Now, there's no need for such roughness. Cool hands closed around Sara's arms, guiding her upright with deceptive gentleness. Just hop up on the table, Sara, and try to relax. This won't hurt a bit. I promise. It was a lie. The pain was beyond anything Sara had ever known. A symphony of agony in blades and needles and searing jolts of electricity. She screamed until they gagged her, thrashing against her bonds as they coolly sliced into her flesh. It went on for an eternity, until merciful blackness finally rose up to claim her. She woke in her cage, dressed in a clean shirt and jeans, arms and legs swathed in bandages. Her mind shied away from examining too closely how she'd gotten from there to here. Time blurred, marked only by the dull throb of her wounds, the intermittent terror of the others being dragged away. Catalia tried to comfort her, promising it would get easier. Sara wasn't sure whether that made it better or so much worse. They took her again the next week. She fought this time, lashing out with the desperate strength of a caged animal. But it only ended with a needle in her neck and restraints biting into her wrists. She returned to awareness already back in her cell, a howling anguish radiating from where they had pumped some new cocktail of torment into her veins. For days, any movement brought excruciating bolts of pain lancing through her shoulders and back. Eating, walking, even breathing became a study in agony. The others watched her with weary, knowing eyes. Catalia, Vicente, Richard. She understood now the suffering etched into their two young faces, the scars they bore on body and soul. "Does it get better?" she asked one night, voice cracking on the childish plea. Catalia rushed to reassure her, but it rang hollow. Richard just met her gaze, unflinching, and shook his head. Sara was horribly grateful for his honesty. Days bled together, time measured in experiments endured, scars accumulated, hopes dashed anew. The four of them clung to each other, a fragile lifeline against the cruelties inflicted. At night, Sara mapped the ceiling of her cage and tried not to catalog each new hurt. She recited the sparse facts of her outside life like a prayer. Sara, 14, red hair, brother named Sammy. It was Sammy's face, Sammy's name, that kept her fighting through the worst of it. She had to survive, had to escape, had to find him. Nothing else mattered. And when the darkness pressed too close, she would drift over to the edge of her cage and whisper across to Richard, the two of them keeping vigil until exhaustion won out. She marked 1 month since her arrival, wondering with dull resignation how many more there would be. What they were doing to them, what purpose their pain served, remained a sickening mystery. But she knew with mounting certainty that this was no life, that they had to get out, somehow, before it hollowed them out completely. As Sara slipped into another fitful sleep, she dreamed of Sammy, not lost or hurt, but smiling that gap-toothed grin, little hands wrapped around his beloved yellow car. Somewhere out there, maybe that Sammy still existed. Somewhere beyond the bars and the blades and the screams. She held that thought close as the darkness closed in, a small candle against the vast black night. It was a hope as fragile as spun glass, as desperate as a whispered prayer. But it was hers, and she would carry it, that tiny ember, for as long as she still drew breath. For herself, for Catalia and Vicente and Richard. For Sammy, no matter what fresh hell tomorrow held.